This sewing snack video is geared towards the very beginning sewer. We're going to talk about the Sewist Lexicon. I've chosen 14 of the most common sewing terms, and we're just going to go through them and talk about what they mean. For starters, let's talk about what a seam is. A seam is the line where two pieces of fabric are joined together by your thread. So this is just a simple seam. We've sewn two pieces of fabric together. A seam allowance is the small space of fabric between the fabric edge and where that seam is. Common seam allowances range from 1/4 inch to 5/8 inch, and sometimes even a 1/2 inch, or sometimes as small as a scant 1/4 inch. A scant 1/4 inch is one that I often use for basting, and we'll talk about basting in a moment, but the scant 1/4 inch presser foot is my very favorite presser foot to use. And so when I use this as a guide for my stitching, I get a scant 1/4 inch. Stitch length is the distance between two consecutive needle punctures in a stitch. It's measured in millimeters. 2.5 is the most commonly used for seams, and 3.5 is commonly used for top stitching. Basting commonly uses a 3.5 or greater stitch length, depending on the purpose of the basting. Stitch width. For certain stitches, the distance between the needle and the outer edge of the stitch, controlling how far the needle moves from side to side. Stitch width doesn't apply to straight stitches like the ones I generally use in my patterns. Baste stitch. This is a technique of hand stitching or machine stitching where you use a very long stitch length. You can see the difference here. This seam has a 2.5 inch stitch length, whereas this basting stitch has a 4.5 inch stitch length. The fabric looks a little bit puckered. This isn't going to hold up well in a seam normally, but if you are stitching temporarily to hold two pieces of fabric together before they're stitched together permanently, or for some other techniques, then you will use this longer stitch length. And it's really optional whether you want to backstitch at the beginning and end of your stitching, because perhaps you'll change your mind and you'll want to pull that stitching out, and it's much easier to do so if you haven't done the backstitching. So what is backstitching? Let's look at these seams here. The backstitching is what you do at the very beginning and end of sewing your seam. You'll have either a lever or a button on your sewing machine, just depending on your machine, that will allow your machine to sew backwards. That simply locks your stitches in place so that they don't come loose. Now, top stitch. Top stitching is the line of stitching that is intentionally visible on the right side of a sewn project, often for decorative or functional purposes, maybe both. A longer stitch length is generally used for top stitching. Depending on personal preference, this could be in a matching or contrasting color. Okay, selvage. You will hear the term selvage a lot. If you have a bolt of fabric along the long edge of the fabric, you will have what's called a selvage edge. And that selvage is just reinforced in some way by the fabric manufacturer to keep it from completely unraveling. This is a very common thing in woven fabric like this. Another fabric-related term is bias, and I've done an entire video that explains bias. I'll link that in the description below. But bias is basically your fabric, instead of going with the grain, you're going cross grain at a 45-degree angle from the selvage edge, and that gives you a nice stretch. In woven fabrics, you don't have a lot of stretch when you're going with the grain, but cross grain, you get a nice stretch. Casing is a small tunnel of fabric through which a drawstring or length of elastic can be threaded. For example, this drawstring channel in this little basket, or if you think about a scrunchie, that's basically a casing that has some elastic through it. Maybe the waistband of a skirt or pants that has an elastic waistband, that would be a casing. Interfacing is the term used for a variety of materials that are used on the wrong sides of fabric. They're either fused or sewn in, and it gives the fabric a more or different stability or loft, whatever the desired effect may be. So this is just a medium weight fusible interfacing here, and it will take out a little bit of the stretch of the fabric, give it a little bit more body. This is a fusible fleece, which will give it more loft and softness. This is a firm stabilizer or interfacing that will give it some structure. Another term you will hear in patterns very frequently is to clip or snip your corners. And that basically means snipping the little corner off where your seam stitching meets. And that reduces bulk when you're sewing an item. And our final term for this video is press. Press can mean to finger press something, and once in a while my patterns will say to finger press, and that can just make a little crease or hold something in place until you're able to sew it. Most often though, you're going to press with an iron, and that is just going to hold the seam open, make a crease where it needs to be made in order to go back to your machine and sew it. Sometimes we'll press our entire project at the end so that it looks nice and we get the wrinkles out. And that wraps up today's sewing snack video. If you have questions about Sewist Lexicon, go ahead and drop them in the comments below, and feel free to like and subscribe. And as always, until next time, happy sewing.